question, but we have to create some kind of priority due to time restraints. The first question is by a man named Russell, and he asks, open quotes, Jock often speaks about the abolishment of prisons and police, but it appears you have deviated from this disposition as you referred to it in a prior talk as rhetoric. That fact being considered, how do you think socially disruptive behavior, to include murder and sexual violence, will be negated? Do you still condone the use of formal correctional institutions? Unquote, end of question. Well, Russell, I kind of wish you paid a little more attention, because the rhetoric that I stated was more to generalize the concept of the abolition of prisons and police and what it actually means, which is the removal of aberrant behavior. It's not a deviation whatsoever. There is a thing that I call the humanity factor. While we can see the scientific causality of the human being, while we know that there's a cause and effect relationship, it's very complicated. And unfortunately, very little study, in comparison to what's necessary, is being done in the human sciences to think about human causal behavior. In the first section of Zeitgeist Moving Forward, I spent an enormous amount of time expressing that. And one thing I learned from all of those extremely professional people that are much more knowledgeable than Jacques Fresco, by the way, on the issue of human behavior, because they study it on a daily basis, what I learned is that there's an element there that is unpredictable. There's always going to be a small percentage that's very, very, very difficult to find the root source of, at least over the course of time. So when I describe what's possible in the future, it's explicitly referencing Jacques' rhetoric. It's the exact same logic, but it isn't with the blanket statement that, okay, in the Venus Project, as they might say, we're abolishing prisons and police. There's an undercurrent that has to deal with that small percentage, that's the victimization, known as I call it, the humanity factor, that's very unpredictable. That doesn't mean you can't remove 99% of the prisons and the prison population. That doesn't mean you can't remove 99% of the police. The approach that we need to take is the understanding of how bad our system is as far as its approach to correcting human behavior, realizing the root source of human behavior, and applying the scientific method, obviously, from the ground up, meaning from the very beginning of the social institutions' placement in the human life. In other words, from the moment people are born, there needs to be an understanding of how they are culminated. And that's unfortunately long lost. Parents don't get any education on how kids should be raised. It's some of the horrors, if you read Gabor Mate, he describes some of the horrors and irrational logic that parents used to use on their children, especially in infancy, that disturbed them for their entire life, created emotional loss. You look at people, Charles Manson's a classic example of a generated psychopath. The guy was in and out of prison his whole life. He came from a horrible family background. It's very easy to see, but it's also difficult to predict at what point and in what confluence of events such actions will emerge. I hope that's understandable. I just feel it's almost negligent to just say that there will be a world without police and prisons when you begin to understand the complexity of the human condition. I don't know enough about the human condition, nor does anyone else, nor does Jacques, nor does the greatest scientific minds on the planet, to say that we can abolish all forms of aberrant behavior based on the sociological definition of aberrancy, which is, of course, relative to the social environment. That's too difficult. But there's an enormous amount of information there that can subside all of that. So to summarize my point, yes, we can approach it. We can hyperbolate towards no prisons and police. But that extra 1%, that extra point, that's going to be very difficult to overcome, and it's going to probably take a long period of time. So to answer your final question, do I condone the use of formal correctional institutions? Formal correctional institutions, no. As they exist today, people should not be punished for anything. Except past a certain point. Children can deal with punishment, not physical abuse, not emotional abuse, but putting correction. Children don't know any better. And what happens at these young stages is an inhibition's created where people don't mature properly, and punishment just makes them worse because their maturity is not there. When you look at adults that have severe problems and violence, it's a maturity issue on a certain level. And it comes from certain things that shouldn't have happened and certain things that should have happened, in the words of Gabor Mate. And this is how this type of aberrancy of behavior is culminated. And it's not specific in 100% as far as how we understand it, and there are lots of factors. That's my point. But people should be put in caring facilities. Those that attribute such those that commit such atrocities should be put in facilities that don't threaten them, but they can be studied and they can be interviewed and understood as to what happened to them. And you'll find that everything I've just said is actually completely in line with what Jacques Fresco talks about. I was simply addressing the overarching statement, which I think is far too gratuitous and turns a lot of people off in communication when you talk that way, because it just sounds